Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Explore More, Bark Less, Leash Foundations and Safety Cues. My name is Katelin Thomas, and I am going to be your presenter today. So one of the things that we think about when we're starting to work with our reactive dogs is that we think about before we start working on reactivity, what are the foundations that our dogs need to know? So when we're thinking about what are we going to do about our dog or a client's dog or a case that we have with a dog who's reactive, one of the things I think that we see most often is people kind of have this assumption that they can just jump right in and start training. But we have to sort of think of it like each of these little pieces are sort of prerequisites to getting set up for reactivity. So before we work on calculus, let's slow down and we got to get some foundations in place. So things like a really good loose leash walk, or having the right equipment on your dog, or having the right kind of mindset when you jump into training are all really important that we do before we jump into training with reactivity. So today's lecture is just about the leash foundations and safety cues. I will tell you that we are not going to allow questions or we won't be answering questions in the middle of the lecture today, but I will be closing the lecture out and opening up to questions at the end. So as your questions come up, if you just want to kind of give me some context. So if say we're passing the loose leash walking slide and you have a question about loose leash walking, maybe you would just write loose leash walking question and then insert your question, and I will hopefully have time to get to those at the end. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So when you get started, some of the equipment that you might want to consider getting before you hit the road with training is getting a collar that's well fit and is comfortable for your dog, getting your dog a harness. A treat pouch is really helpful so that you've got kind of your reinforcers ready and right in your pocket so that you can easily pull them out and reinforce when you need to. Having leashes, the right leashes is really important, valuable. Having a muzzle, if your dog is, we'll kind of get into how do we decide what type of equipment we use with dogs as we get a little bit more into the lecture, but we're going to touch on muzzles a little bit, and an in-training vest. So what we like about the in-training vest, it's not as much for the dog as it is for the people around your dog to be able to identify this dog needs a little bit more space. So sometimes people will do, there's a little yellow ribbon that's going around leashes these days, and it's a part of what they call the Yellow Dog Project. And it's essentially a little ribbon that goes on your leash that says my dog needs a little bit more space. But unfortunately, that's not something that the whole world knows about. So those don't really work for everyone. But the in training, really, people do tend to give dogs a little bit more space if they know that you're already working, as opposed to kind of the hey, can I pet your dog? And then you end up in a situation where you're a little bit stuck. So jumping into collars and harnesses. So one of the things that we really like is a martingale collar or a flat buckle collar. They work really well. The martingale collar is a collar that will tighten, and it kind of tightens around the neck in a similar way. It's like a nose slip. So it can't pull over the head, but unlike a choke chain, it's not going to keep restricting, it's not going to keep pushing on the neck. So the harnesses that we like, really the options here are either a front clip harness, so it clips to the front of the dog's chest, a rear clip harness, so it clips to the back, or both. So the 2 Hounds Freedom harness has 2 options where you can hook to the front or hook to the back. What's really nice about hooking to the front is if you do find yourself in a position where your dog is pulling forward or is starting to get a little bit too uncomfortable for the situation you're in, if you have to kind of pull them out for safety purposes, it is turning their body around as opposed to yanking them from their back and kind of pulling against their body, which can be pretty aversive for them. The Sensation harness is a brand that we like, and the Balance harness is a brand that we like. So those are all pretty good options. So we do want to note, really as a culture, the team, we like to focus on what people, can do or should be doing or can work on, as opposed to what they shouldn't be doing. But we did want to take a quick second to just give you a little caution for quick fix tools. So one of the things that we think about when we're selecting tools for our dogs is, are they comfortable? Is our dog in pain because of them? Is it aversive to us or aversive to them? And really anything in the category kind of aversives for your dog, or what your dog would choose to avoid, we just kind of skip those. Because if your dog is working on an issue like reactivity, where say they're fearful of other dogs and they display behaviors such as barking and lunging on leash, really we don't want to add another aversive stimulus. So say they bark and they lunge at a dog, and then they get, you know, maybe a prong collar and it pulls on the neck or it pokes into the neck. That really is kind of adding to that bad situation for that dog and adding a little bit of stress. So for some dogs, quite a bit of stress. So really any of the tools that kind of tack on to that negative experience is really working against us when we're trying to train. So kind of the way that we think about tools is your tools don't replace your training. So any tool that is kind of being highlighted or marketed as a tool that does the training for you, those are kind of, you know, that's a little bit of red flaggy. We kind of tend to stay away from those. So your tools don't replace your teaching. So when you're working on reactivity, really what you're doing is you are creating kind of a nice learning environment for your dog, and you're working with them. Really, the tool is not going to fix kind of what's happening psychologically for your dog. And it could potentially make it much worse for them. So we try to avoid those things. So kind of think of your tools, whatever tools are on your dog, whether it's your leash, your collar, your harness, your vest, no matter what it is, really think of them more like safety equipment instead of necessarily a part of your training plan. So it's more so like a seat belt in the car. Those things are for emergencies, and you use them and you should wear them every single time. But the amount of times that you actually need them where they keep you safe, those are really in your dangerous situations. So we're really not using any of our tools, no matter what it is, as if they are a part of the training. They're more so there just in case something goes wrong. So in case your dog gets so uncomfortable where they're pulling towards a dog, or in case they're you know, starting to feel a little bit of discomfort and they start you know, pulling out from their collar or something like that. Or just the tools really are just kind of there just in case. So kind of think of it like that when you're starting training. So one of the things here that I added was muzzle training. So muzzles are a really great tool, and we kind of have this in our foundations and safety cues, just because it's something that we do want to think about when we're kind of what we call our dog, what we call getting dressed. So it's something that really should be fun for your dog. We're not, you know, when we start muzzle training, it's a very, very slow process. So we're starting at a level where the dog is very comfortable, and then slowly asking them to keep, you know, say their face in a muzzle for a little bit longer. So I'm going to go ahead and play this little video for you. This is of a dog, Denver, and I'll let you watch this. So he's going to put his head right in here and just hang out for a minute. He's going to get his "yes, you did a great job, sir." He'll get his reinforcer here, and we're going to do it again. Good job. So he's a little bit stressed here. This is not related to the muzzle. It's more the environment. There was something going on that day that was making him a little bit uncomfortable. The training part he really enjoyed. So, but when we're looking at our muzzle training, really we want to be making sure that the dog is offering the behavior. So the point, you know, the reason that this video is in here is because I wanted to just highlight the importance of making sure that the dog is offering the behavior. If you notice, when I put the muzzle down, I'm not moving the muzzle towards the dog. I am always allowing him to come into the muzzle. So I'm placing the muzzle right in front of me and then saying, "Opportunity is open. Would you like to put your face inside?" He puts his face in. We're waiting a couple of seconds. We've built that over time. He gets his "yes, you did it right," and then he gets his reinforcer. So it's just really important in any tools. If you ever pull out a tool and your dog puts its head down or walks away or is a little bit uncomfortable when you go to put a harness on, just make sure that you're kind of taking note of that, because if you're going to take your dog out to do something like train with something that they're scared of, we want to make sure that they're not uncomfortable physically in the equipment that they have on. And all of us have worn a pair of shoes that are a little bit too small, or pants that don't quite fit right, or we have a tag on the back of our shirt that's a little bit itchy during the day. And really that kind of takes over what you're, you know, kind of how you feel and what's happening, you know, in your perception of what's happening around you. You can be more irritable if you're a little bit uncomfortable with what you're physically wearing. There are a whole host of things that kind of come along with a dog being uncomfortable in gear that they're wearing. So if and when we start the muzzle training process, we just want to make sure that it is really something that the dog is offering. So, whoops. Sorry about that. Here we go. So leashing, 2 points of contact. So something that's really important with our reactive dogs is we always have them wearing 2 points of contact. So the dog should have 2 leashes on at any given moment every time that they are out in public, leave the house, or somewhere where they might encounter a trigger. So we've got one collar you can see here on this little beagle. Her name is Elwood, and she is the most lovely little thing. And so she has her harness that is clipped right to the back of her, her leash that is clipped right to the back of her harness. And then she has a secondary leash here that you can see is clipped to her collar. So that little pink collar that's around her neck. So what's happening here, she's actually in a reactive class, and that's her trainer there that she's taking a peek at. And you can see the first leash that they have that's hooked to the rear, that is the leash that they're actually using. So that's the leash that's physically in their hand. This black leash that's kind of hanging low here on her collar, we don't want any pressure on the neck because that can be a really sensitive area. So we're going to be, they're using this rear clip. If she were to pull, you can see that top leash is a little bit tighter than that bottom one. So that top one is kind of going to catch her and support that weight of her body, where this black leash here is just kind of swinging down and is on her neck. But in the event that, say something happened where, you know, someone slipped and they dropped their leash, this black leash here is hooked around her waist. So this black leash is a waist leash, and so it's hooked around her waist and then hooked to the collar. So worst case scenario, someone falls, a dog lunges, something happens that's not expected, it's not a part of the plan, you don't have your dog or another person's dog or a person in danger or potentially put at risk because of an accidental mistake. So the 2 points of contact is critical to make sure that we keep our dogs safe. So this dog here on the right, her name is Clementine, and she's also just a lovely little dog. And something that happened with her that was a kind of a big, powerful thing. They were out training, and they were training reactivity. They were in a park, and you know, it's always one of those things where you think you don't need it until it happens to you. And so she had posted later on the page after that, she said, the worst thing happened today. We were in class, or we were out at the park, and I looked down and one of her leashes was unclipped from her harness, and that's never happened before. I don't know how it happened. And there was a flash of panic before I realized she has her other leash on. So it just is kind of something that we want to keep in mind. We want to make sure that it's going to, you know, in the beginning, it feels a little bit uncomfortable. You have to get comfortable having 2 leashes, or, you know, having one on your body and one in your hand. And it's one of those things that a lot of people glaze over. And it is really important part of the process to make sure that we've got our safety things in place. So protected contact. This is a video of Kate Wilson and the cougar Harper that she's working with. We don't have a really excellent one of dogs, or I would have put that in here, but I'll kind of show you what they're using here. They're using this protected contact as a tool. So what she's doing is they're training through the barrier. So the cougar is safe and everyone around her is safe. It's very easy for people to kind of say, oh, my dog doesn't need the muzzle. Oh, my dog doesn't need the barrier. So the equivalent to this would be like a chain link fence, say. But you don't really know when you need it until you need it. So Harper's very happy here, and Harper lives at the Creature Conservancy, who takes very good care of her. And so they're using this just to be sure that everyone is safe and that she doesn't put herself in a situation or get uncomfortable and then feel the need to react, because the damage of that would be pretty big. So safety considerations. What are we going to have our dogs wearing out in public? So some of the things that I think about for safety is, what is the behavior of the dog? What does it look like? How severe or how intense is the lunging or the barking? And so we just kind of look at that to see, do we need a waist leash and a handheld? Do we need 2 handheld leashes? What's the most comfortable thing for us and our dog? Bite history. When I'm looking at bite history, I'm looking at the severity of the bites. So did the dog, maybe an off-leash dog ran up to your dog on leash and they, you know, barked and lunged and they pinned the dog, but there were no bites that happened. So, but then the opposite of that would be a dog ran up and the other dog had to be hospitalized because of the severity of the wound, or potentially something more serious. And so I'm just really looking at the severity. What was the severity of incidents that have happened? I take a little bit more caution, or much more caution, I should say, with dogs who have a little bit of a higher severity in their bite. So, or the history. So the frequency, how many times has it happened? How often is it happening, and to whom, in what environments? I'm really trying to look skipping down to environments here, jumping a step. So I'm really trying to look at what is the environment, how difficult is it for the dog to train in, how difficult is it for the handler to train in, are there any unknown variables in the area? Maybe we're up north at a state park and there's no cars or people or dogs in sight. Maybe other people are trying to walk through a downtown area where there are frequently dogs passing on the sidewalk, or you're walking through a neighborhood that has invisible fences, that kind of thing. What's the risk? What are the unknown variables? And we just kind of take those into consideration. And it looks like bite history is doubled up here. So training foundations. We're going to jump into some training foundations. This is my favorite part. So before you even think about starting training, what I want you to consider and really put some nice thought into is, how does your dog feel about training? So we want to make sure, kind of in the same light of how comfortable is your dog in the equipment that they're wearing, how comfortable is your dog in a training setting? So the equivalent to that for us would be, say you're a student. How comfortable are you being in a classroom and learning? Are you nervous? Are you anxious to be engaged in that type of learning environment? Are you really confident and feel like, yes, I can do this. I really love learning. I love collaborating on projects. I love talking out loud. I love, or are you a little bit more timid and nervous and weary of those situations? So it's really important, because how the dog feels about training is going to bleed over into how much progress they make and how much better they feel when they start working on reactivity. So say you really, really, really dislike learning new things around new people or learning new things in new spaces, and I put you into like a soccer class. You might not have as much fun as a student who says, I really love learning new things. And so we want to make sure that the dog feels really good about training before we pop them into training on reactivity, which is our ultimate goal. We don't want them taking that, how they feel about training, and having that kind of be negative or not so great, and having that bleed over into our reactivity training, because that's not exactly what our goal is. So number 2, what is your dog's training history? Have they had training in the past? Do they know how to learn? So when we're talking about teaching dogs new skills or working on new things, it's kind of interesting, because some dogs don't really know how to learn. We have to actually teach them. We have to sit down and kind of start kind of tapping into that potential, because dogs that have had no learning history or no teaching history, they kind of lack the foundation there of knowing how to work with people and how to kind of cooperate with people and how to kind of learn, really. So it's that's kind of a piece there. And then what is the dog's relationship and history with the handler? So before we jump into reactivity training, we are thinking about, does the dog trust the handler that is working with them? Because if your dog is fearful or your dog is really frustrated by the things around them, we want to make sure that the person who's there as their ally and their advocate and their support, and kind of the person there that can say, hey, I got it. You don't have to worry about it. I'm in control here. I've got the situation handled. We want to make sure that they can trust that. So that's kind of something that we're always considering, and we're wanting to make sure that the dogs are very comfortable before we put them in a situation where we say, trust us, and while we work through your biggest fear, when they might not necessarily trust us per se in other areas. So we're kind of looking at that. So how do we build a positive training history? So when we're talking about building a positive training history, we are thinking learning should be fun on both ends. We all know what it's like to learn from a teacher who is frustrated at the time, or learn from a teacher who is a little bit annoyed with our questions, or a little bit in a hurry and trying to kind of rush through things. It's really challenging to enjoy yourself when your when your training partner isn't having a good day, or isn't having a lot of fun, or isn't really in it with you. So biggest thing, most important thing, is making sure that you're having fun and your dog is having fun. So it's really easy with behaviors that we find aversive as humans, like barking and lunging and pulling on leash, and those behaviors on the human end can be very frustrating to be experiencing with the dog. So if we're frustrated while we're trying to teach them, it kind of creates a little bit of a barrier there, and it makes it harder for us to get through, and really harder for us to get through these big issues. So we want to make sure that we're having fun. We want to make sure that both our dog as well as the handler are really in it and enjoying themselves. So how do we do that? How do we get there? So the first thing is, before you hit the road and start working on reactivity, we want to start working on some fun training games. So just having fun with your dog? How do you work together? So maybe teaching a fun behavior like spin. Spin in a circle when I cue spin, and I spin my little hand around and you twist in a circle. It's a very fun little trick that's very easy to teach and gets the dog moving and gets the dog using their brain and gets you really learning how to work with them and them how to work with you. Or maybe we teach sit for the first time using positive reinforcement. So say you've been training by doing what we call molding, or like pushing the dog's bottom down to the ground until they sit and then saying good boy or something like that. Maybe we've been training in a way where we're kind of doing a little bit more adding a little bit of an aversive stimulus until the dog says, okay, I'll sit, and then we give a treat, or then we give it praise, and kind of switching that over to say, what if I just use positive reinforcement? What if we take all the stress out? What if we take all the pressure out? Can I teach you how to figure something out for yourself without physically pushing you to get there? So it's kind of a challenge to kind of push to see, can I communicate effectively with you? Can I get what I want, which is your bottom on the ground? Can I get what I want by just teaching you in a way where I'm not forcing you? So it's kind of a fun little challenge. Foundations without fear, that's kind of where we're going there. And then being your dog's safety. So what foundations does your dog need to feel safe? Really, that depends on the dog, and that's something that you're going to have to consider before you start. So what do they need? I just want to take a little time to make a quick note on arousal, because this is something that when we're in training can be very challenging for people to understand and understand why their dog isn't able to do the same behaviors in a new environment, or they're so worked up that they can't focus. So something that is a common problem with our dogs with reactivity is arousal. So arousal is something that is largely out of their control. It's a chemical response, something happening in their body. So for us, what we're thinking about when we're looking at arousal really is, how in control is the dog? So say you are, say you're at your favorite place in the whole entire world, say it's Cedar Point, and you're at the very front of the line for the roller coaster. Your heart's racing, you're really pumped up, your palms are sweaty, you're getting ready to go on, your whole body's kind of shaking, you can't sit still, you're getting impatient as you get to the front of the line, your arousal is building. That is largely out of your control. So I could say, okay, I want you to sit down and calm yourself down. But even if you know what you should be doing, it's really challenging for you to kind of put that into action, or make those physiological changes just because you want them to happen in your body. So for us, we just want to look at arousal and think, can the dog actually do it? Are we asking them to sit down and process and learn a new thing while they're in a place where their body can't physically do that? So if you're really, really excited and I try to get you to be calm and listen to quiet instructions, it's actually challenging for your brain to get there. So one of the things that we do, this is a very sweet little guy dually who came into a basic manners class that we had, and he just couldn't contain his little self. So she would tell him to sit, he would sit beautifully, and then he would pop right up and he was bouncing around and he couldn't settle. And then he wouldn't be able to, every move she made, he would jump up and hit her face, or every time she took a step, he would jump up and grab at her arms, or he would grab at his leash and get really aroused. So when she would try to do something like tell him dually sit, or come with me, or wait quietly, he really wasn't capable of that. So one of the activities that we do is called Jazz Up, Settle Down. And the goal of this is get your dog excited and then let them bring themselves down. They get excited and then they bring themselves back down. So a little bit of excitement at a manageable level, and then they reset. And then a little bit of excitement, and then they reset. And some of this is just physical changes in their bodies that we're really prompting, where we're getting them a little bit excited. If I get them too excited, what's going to happen is that they won't be able to calm down. So we have to do this in very small pieces. So I'm going to let you guys watch this. It's just a short little clip. And what she's going to do is she's going to click the second he chooses to sit. So she's getting excited. He sits, she clicks, and she feeds and does it again. Excellent. There you go, buddy. So she's given him a little bit more time there. You can see towards the end of that, she starts giving him a little bit more time before she clicks. So he sits, she waits a second, clicks and feeds. So what I really like about what she's doing here is she's doing this at a level where he can do it. He doesn't have any times where he bursts up and jumps and grabs at her arm and displays the old behavior, because she's keeping this at a level that's manageable for him. So she's keeping this at a nice low level where she's not getting him so excited that he can't come back down. She's just bits and pieces doing exactly what he's capable of at the time. So as you start working and learning with your dog, really one of the things that we're doing is we're kind of teaching you and the dog both how to work with each other. So her how to read the dog and know, when can I make it harder? When do I need to make it easier? When do I feel like maybe I was asking a little bit too much from him. So that's what we're doing here. She practiced this about 4 or 5 days at home. She then started working on it in new locations. And then about 5 days later, she brought it into class. So what we want to do is we want to teach this in a calm setting. Then we start adding distractions in the calm setting. So maybe other people walking around, coming in and out of the room, maybe bouncing a ball, all sorts of things we can add, maybe twisting in circles, jumping up and down, and oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, and then waiting, and they sit and then feed. And so we've got lots of options, but then we add it to new locations. So we don't just want to jump and start practicing this in a new space, because that could potentially be too distracting for the dog. So default weighted doors. This is something that when we're working with our dogs is a really beautiful behavior to have established, because it creates an automatic pause before they walk out the door. So what I like to do is I like to make it automatic as opposed to being cued. So I don't want to say every time I walk out, wait, stay there, and then go out. I want them just to wait all on their own. I want them, as soon as they approach the threshold, to know I stop here and then I get released through. So I'll show you, this is a dog named Moxie, and Moxie is reactive, but he's a happy little guy, very frustrated, a little bit scared of people, very good with dogs, but reactive. And so what they did, they were very worried because they live in a street that's slightly busy and the cars can go kind of fast up and down. And so they didn't want him potentially running out to go either say hello to a dog or to kind of rush out and see a person there. So this is what they did with him. Beautifully done. So what they're doing here is he's built this all the way up to where he can get excited with him and say, oh my gosh, let's go for a walk, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. And even as he walks out, he's to the point now they can kind of pull on that leash even, and dog stays put. How we get there is what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand at that doorway. I'm going to treat that dog for staying on that side of the threshold. So staying inside is the most reinforcing behavior there. So if he crosses over, he doesn't get in trouble, nothing bad happens. We just bring him right back in and try again. So in the event that he pops out too soon while we're in the training process, I just know that I jumped a step too early, similar to the dog in the last video. We just want to make sure it's really up to the handler to make sure that the dog is successful. So we think of it like, in this case, the handler is the teacher and the dog is the student. So if we give the student too difficult of curriculum too fast, we know that they're going to fail. And if we see consistent, what we call failures, or we see consistently the dog is doing the behavior that you are not selecting for or you're trying to select against, then we know that we need to slow down, back up, and build a little bit of a stronger foundation before we get to that difficulty level. So for this guy, we were not in a place, of course, in the beginning where he could just walk right out and the dog would stop, because the dog always was ready and excited to go explore the world and wanted to go out and have a great time. So what we do is we treat the dog at that side of the threshold, and we consistently do that until we give an okay, and then let the dog cross over and feed, reset it again. But we build that reinforcement history pretty strong. And then we start slowly adding distraction where you're stepping out. And then if the dog does not follow, and by stepping out, sometimes I just move my foot like a centimeter, or, really an inch or 2 inches or 4 inches and then 6, so that I'm not having the dog pop out thinking, oh, we're going, and then walking. I just almost leaning my body outside. The dog doesn't cross the threshold. And then I say yes. And then I feed it on the inside. So I'm feeding it over in that tile area where you see behind the door. And then he's going to rush up to the door. He's going to stop right there. I'm going to yes, and then do it again. So we're slowly building difficulty. So, and I'll have a video of this that I will send to you guys at the end. So default weight at the car. So again, importance of what happens when you get to a new location, especially something we have to think of for our reactive dogs, is that we might not want our dog jumping out first thing right away, coming out really aroused and excited as we get to a new location, because a lot of the times what we have to do before we start jumping in and and working in a new spot is we have to check for dogs, we have to check for people, we have to make sure that the environment is safe for our reactive dog. So we really don't want the dog to be in the car either impatient, where they're anticipating that they should have gotten, that they're going to get out and something really exciting is going to happen, or that they're frustrated because they're having to wait in the car while we do other things, because that's going to set the tone for that training session. So I want to make sure before training starts, the second that you start working with your dog, it doesn't start when you arrive in the new location. So from the moment you're in your car with your dog and you're starting to get ready, that's where your training's starting, and how that dog feels about that experience is going to bleed over into the session or into your exercise activity or whatever it is that you're doing. So a big important thing is we want to make the waiting reinforcing. We want to make the waiting fun, and we want to give the dog a cue, a verbal cue that says, okay, now you can get out. So again, one of the reasons that we're working so cooperatively to teach our dogs to wait is because I don't want to add any aversives to that experience for that dog. So, we think of if I had to open up the car and say, get a bag out, but I didn't want my dog to follow. Is the dog expecting that in that moment they should, they're getting out, that they're ready to go? Because if you're next in line and then someone says, okay, something else actually has come up, you need to wait longer, that can create a lot of frustration. So I want the wait to be the default. And then I want a cue for them to say, okay, it's time. So I'll show you what we did here. This is actually that same dog, Dooley, that was working on that Jazz Look Settle Down. And this is one of his primary caretakers who was very worried that she was going to be pulled down. And so we worked on this behavior because it was one of the behaviors that she said was really it was a stressful thing for her when they entered a new environment. So this is something that we fixed both for the handler of the dog and for the dog to make their experience together a little bit more positive. So you'll see here what they do with him. She doesn't believe it. She almost doesn't believe it's happening. This was the very first session that we worked on this behavior. And so you could see it's very cute. She's pretty excited that they got this fast, because he looks pretty good in there. So, but this is kind of what we want it to look like when we get to a new place. So capturing a check-in. What this is a behavior that we build before we ever take our dogs out and practice reactivity. So one of the things is a lot of dogs that, a lot of dogs have a kind of a history of, when we're out in new places with people, I just walk wherever I would like to go. And, we kind of walk together, but they're not really checking in with the person, because the person is the least interesting thing in a new environment a lot of the time. So what we want to do is we have to build that. We have to build that, kind of that reinforcement history of, have you been reinforced for looking at your person, for checking in, for seeing where you're headed, for asking for the next cue? So we just, while we're prepping for that, we want to make sure that we're getting our dogs to check in with us. I have a really incredible video that you can find on our website, or I'm going to send it out after this so that everyone has it that's attended today, on how to teach this behavior, but it's one that we'll start with in our living room. This is a video of my most recent reactive dog, Blue. And you can see every time he looks at me, I yes and feed. So he's going to sniff here. There, I actually coaxed him away from that because it was something that I didn't want him to have, because there was fertilizer put on that day. So I wanted to keep him out of the grass. So I just coaxed him away, and then yes and checked in. I'm sorry, and then I yes and reinforced when he checked in. So I'll let you watch that again, since I was talking through, and you can kind of see what happens. So what I'm doing here is, the second that he checks in with me, or even his head when I'm starting, even if, say he's looking ahead, and his head starts to turn towards my body. In the beginning stages, I will yes and reach in my bag and give him a piece of my high value food that I have for that day. So I want anything even remotely, because you're not going to get this beautiful check-in on your first time out. So we're going to take it in bits and pieces and set it up so that your dog can, we can slowly shape what we want your dog to do. So they start to turn their head toward your knee, yes, and then feed. And then eventually you get this nice little check-in as you add difficulty. Can't quite hear my clicker in here. Coaxed him away there, fed for him leaving it. And this is right in front of my house. So this is not, we're not going to take this. This is his version of a new location. So we started, this is actually his very first training session doing this in front of the house. And the training session total in duration was probably about 1.5 minutes. So not too long. At first we practiced in the living room, just when I'm walking and you check in with me, just reinforcing that on leash. And then we took it in the backyard, and then we took it into the driveway, and then we took it onto the sidewalk. So just really slowly adding difficulty for the dog, because we know that in a brand new location, it's very hard to use these behaviors. So kind of think of it like, you know, if you have a child that doesn't know how to say thank you, then when they're at Disney World, it's going to be much harder to get them to use that, you know, behavior, because it's just more distracting. There are other things going on, much less the stressors that our reactive dogs are experiencing. So we really want to make sure that this is a behavior that we have reinforced a lot before we hit the road. So this is a video of loose leash walking. So something that I think that a lot of people want to kind of skip ahead, that's a really critical piece, is, does your dog know how to be calm and be with you on leash without triggers present? So one of the, you know, we think of when we're stacking together our, you know, our training experiences, how hard that can sometimes be, where you're trying to learn multiple things at the same time, especially things that are complex or stressful for you. So say dogs are stressful for your dog. Seeing dogs is something that stresses them out, and they pull or lunge or bark on leash when they see dogs. If the behavior that we would like to get is when you see dogs, stay by my side or check in with me, I would ask, does the dog know how to do that without dogs present? And if the answer is no, then we have to teach that first. So for us, it's you know, what we tend to do, or what I like to do, is just teach it without the leash first. So first, I will do a setup where you are, say, in your living room, and even if you have your leash in your hand, but it's not attached to your dog. So that's something that you can also practice. If your dog sees the leash and they get really, really, really excited, then we're adding arousal, and the arousal is going to make it hard for them to learn and process the information. So there's kind of multiple things that go into this, but what I like is I like learning to walk, especially people that have learned to be reactive because their dogs are reactive. So say your dog in public is, you know, barking and lunging at people on leash, and they're hypervigilant, and every time they see a dog or they see a person or they hear a car go by or they hear a loud noise, they startle or they bark or they lunge. Oftentimes what we find when we go into their homes is that they also have reactive people now. They have reactive guardians, because the people have to watch the environment so carefully for their dogs that the person sees a dog and they start to get stressed, because the experience for them is so negative when their dog displays that type of behavior, that they are actually having a, you know, a physiological response to what's happening. So oftentimes, as you're starting to work on loose leash walking, if you've had a history of, when you see dogs or you see people, having to, you know, physically restrain your dog to keep your dog safe or pull them back, a lot of times those kind of reflexes are in there for you. So you'll see a dog and all of a sudden you tighten up your leash really hard. But for the dog perceives that change. So for the dog, they know, I saw a dog and my person got stressed. They started talking really quickly. They had frustration in their voice. They tightened up my leash. It must mean that dogs are bad. It must mean that you know, that this is something that we want to avoid. It's a stressor. So and they're not necessarily processing it that way, but it's a part of the experience for them. So this is a dog just working with his equipment on loose leash walking. So he's got all of his training equipment on. She's just marking really for duration here. So how long, what she's clicking for is how long he's staying by her side. So at first, when we started this, we started without the leash on, and we had the leash just held in the handler's hand, and we reinforced the dog for walking by her side by choosing to walk by her side. So he would be by her side and she would click. It was almost click, feed, and then click again, feed, click, feed, click, feed. It was so fast. It was dozens and dozens and dozens of trials in a minute. And you can see here now we slowly stretch that out. So again, along the same lines of wanting to make sure that we're not jumping steps, our foundation is the most important part here. So we don't want to jump steps too much, or we can make it hard for our dog to process the information when we start working on reactivity or when we see stressors in the environment. So what we're doing here is just waiting the length of time. So he takes maybe 3 or 4 steps, and then she clicks and feeds. He takes 3 or 4 steps, and then they got to the point where, you know, we're 10, 20, 30 until the loose leash walk is the standard behavior. But here, what they're practicing too is training without dogs or people present before they expose the dog to people. So we don't want the first time that the dog is going to go train around dogs or people for them to just then be put in their new equipment. So just then, for the first time ever, the person is having to learn how to manage 2 leashes, or just then the dog is learning how to wear the muzzle out in a distracting environment. So we want to make sure that the dogs are prepared, but also that you're prepared, that you know how to use your equipment, that you feel comfortable. Everyone knows what it's like when they start driving a car, how you have to think about every single piece of it. You think about, as you're approaching the light, you're going to have to turn your turn signal on, or when you see a yield sign versus a red light or yellow light, or it takes a lot more processing until it becomes second nature. So after some time, it just becomes natural and you don't have to think about it. But it's not just about your dog's comfort here. It's also about you learning to kind of drive the car, so to say. So touch. So this is the behavior that we use that is an operant behavior. So it's we would use it. We're not using this necessarily in the moment when our dogs are feeling uncomfortable, but sometimes we'll use it as an emergency cue if we need to. But what it does is, you can see this picture on the right here, this little cattle dog here training is touching her nose to the trainer's hand. So it's just a nose target, we call it. So the dog's nose will hit the person's hand, and it's almost like a little like boop, and that's exactly what we want. So just by cueing touch is what we call it, the dog turns his head around and bumps your hand. So we think of how useful it might be able to be to redirect a dog's head if we needed to, or to redirect a dog's body. If we want a dog to come with us, kind of what are our options? Or if we need a dog to move through space, say we want the dog to walk from one place to the next, we can sometimes do touch targets where we say touch, dog touches, yes, we feed, and then we take 10 more steps, touch, and it just gives the dog something else to do and something else to think about as they're walking and as they're moving. And it's a really fun one to teach. I will be sending the training link at the end of this so that you guys can have that link of how to. This way is a behavior really that's kind of a casual one. So I want to make sure that I am communicating with my dog in a way that makes both of our experiences fun. So think about what this way is a behavior that tells your dog, hey, we're headed in another direction, or we're headed in this direction. So kind of, you're walking down the street and say you're going to turn right, but your dog is maybe 2 feet in front of you. So they're not necessarily right next to you where they're going to see you turn and turn with you. This way is the cue of, hey, this way, which is we're going in another direction. Or say the dog is, the dog is trying to turn left and you're trying to go straight. You might, oh, hey, this way, helps cue the dog so that the dog knows that you're changing directions before they feel tension on the leash. So what we're trying to do here is minimize the amount of tension that the dog feels and the amount of discomfort that they feel kind of with pressure. You think of if you were walking, if you were taking a nice little walk with a friend and every now and then they pulled at the back of your jacket, or they grabbed your sleeve to pull you in the direction that they wanted you to go, or when you went to turn a corner, they grabbed your wrist and pulled you with them. It's much more aversive and uncomfortable rather than just having a cue that says, hey, let's go this way. And then you move in that direction. So the this way, and I'll send out the link for this too. But what the this way does is just gets the dog moving in your direction. So what we'll do is we'll take treats here. This is a beautiful, wonderful, charming dog named Oreo with the most incredible guardians here who are working with him. And what we want to do here, you can see they're both training with clickers, but you could also use a verbal yes. What we want to do here is basically you just say this way, and then you might even coax, call your dog a little bit. The second they turn their head towards you, we will click or yes, and then feed. So what we're doing is saying, when I say this way and you head in my direction, reinforcement happens. And so we do that over and over until the dog kind of gets the concept of this way means that my person is going to change directions. And that's a pretty reinforcing thing in itself, just kind of being able to avoid that tension on the leash and be able to be communicated with and told what way you're going as opposed to being pulled in that way. So that's really nice. Recall. So recall is critical. It's one of those things that I think is kind of hard for people to wrap their head around. Kind of all of these foundations being built here, kind of the importance of them when we're training. So what we want, the recall really is a very important safety cue to be able to have. So if I say your dog is in your front yard and you know, one of your kids is going to go outside and the dog slips and makes his way into the front yard and maybe has a bite history with dogs. And there's sometimes dogs walking around your neighborhood and you want to get your dog inside quickly. Is there a reinforcement history for coming when called, when in new environments? Is there reinforcement history for coming when called around dogs? Is there a reinforcement history for recall in the house? And for us, it's really important that when we're working with our dogs, we kind of keep in mind, what would we need if things went wrong? So if it was worst case scenario, what would we need to keep our dogs safe? And we want to make sure that we prepare both ourselves and our dogs for those situations. So when we're preparing with training and we're working on something like recall, we want to make sure that when we're training around the dog's trigger, we are not training at a level where the dog is stressed. So this is a little guy practicing this behavior. He is dog reactive. Just a little puppy. They're just training as he's young. He's gonna do it again. Sweet little guy. Sorry for that. I thought they were going to do another trial there. So what he does here, though, is he starts heading towards a dog and they're recalling him back. And despite his size, I think he was 5 months old here. So he's just a very young little guy who was a little bit scared of dogs. So he's a young little dog that was scared of dogs. So we were practicing that recall there. So for us, this is a safe situation because he's not at a level where he's really stressed out by that dog. So the other dog on the other side there was just a practice setup. So the other dog sits still, one dog is reinforced for sitting still, and the other dog is reinforced for being recalled away. So something that I like to do is say, take your dog to a safe environment where maybe there's a fence and maybe there's a dog on the inside of the fence and you're in a big kind of like open field or open area where you can walk away. And your dog can look at their trigger at a distance where they can be safe. So sometimes maybe it's a dog park where you do not go inside, you just stay on the outside really far away. Your dog sees dogs and then you practice your recall. And by really far away, sometimes it's 100 yards. The really far away, everyone, the really far away is relative. So what is really far away? How far does your dog have to be comfortable? And that's the distance that we want to find when we're doing those practice setups. Remember that if your dog is really stressed or really aroused, they're not going to be able to train in the new environment. So emergency recall. The emergency recall is kind of a branch off from our original recall. So what the emergency recall is a recall cue that is in the event of emergency, you want a recall cue that says, come towards me immediately and the most amazing thing in the world is going to happen. And enough so that it overrides anything that they might be interested in the environment, or they've got enough of a history of this behavior of emergency recall back and something really good happens, that if you did need it, like say your dog was rushing towards the fence and you used a cue, the one that we like is let's go. So your dog is at the back fence and we let's go, and then they run in and then they get reinforcement for running inside. So we're really reinforcing that move away. So for dogs, when we're thinking about what is their response when they're uncomfortable, do they, is it fight, flight, freeze? What do they look like? Do they freeze and stand still and they can't move? Do they run towards the dog and rush really quickly or towards the trigger? Are they running away to hide under a table? Those are all versions of reactivity. They all just have different faces. So kind of different sides to the same coin. So whatever your dog is doing, we want to make sure that we have an emergency recall, like a let's go, where we can tell the dog, I know the emergency way out, and if you come with me, I will get you there. So we're kind of taking that, especially for our dogs that are reactive, that are running and lunging towards things, we're taking that and we're saying, instead of that, why don't you run away? Choose another option while you're stressed and while you're in a place where you can't really maintain calm behavior, or say it's like an unexpected situation where a dog maybe turns a corner and it's an emergency and you didn't realize it was coming. We want a cue that we can say, let's go. And then generally what we'll do is actually run in the other direction. So we'll do like a let's go, the dog rushes, and then we run in the other direction. So that's another kind of another piece. But the emergency recall piece of it, which are they're kind of intertwined a little bit, but the emergency recall piece, what we're doing is we're just really making sure we reinforce, come to me and good things will happen. So sometimes what we'll do is, say your dog has a favorite treat in the whole world, maybe it's a bully stick, no hide bone, or it's a special chew or something like that. What we want to do is say your dog is maybe sleeping on the couch or doing something, maybe playing with a toy, and we slowly build this come or here. Sometimes we'll use a cue called here, where we say here and then the dog runs to you. And what we're doing there is we're saying, when you hear this word, really amazing things are going to happen on the other side. So when you come to me, really good things happen. And we always make sure that your reinforcement here is pretty big. It's pretty special for the dog, because we want it to be a really special treat. When they hear that word, they know that really special things are going to happen. So on that other side of things, kind of what I blended the two a little bit for you guys, but is let's go. So what let's go is run away fast to get to safety. So this is that fight, flight, freeze. What's your response if the dog is going towards? We want to have the dog run away. So we want the dog moving towards you. So what you do, dog sees the trigger, and then you let's go, and then run in the opposite direction, so that the dog starts learning, instead of rushing towards dogs, I can always go away. My person knows the way out. And when I hear the cue, let's go, it means go with the person and we will get to safety. So as soon as they turn, I run, and then we feed them as soon as we get to safety. Good job, buddy. You got here. Good. And you guys are really in this together. So you're working together. So foundation tools recap. So we'll just do a really quick recap on our tools. One, martingale collar is a collar that we really like, but we just, the kind of little side note to that is that the collar is almost never experiencing any pressure, or shouldn't be experiencing any pressure on there. Harness, same thing. We kind of walk through what styles we like, but you can choose whatever's most comfortable for your dog. Leashes, making sure that we have 2 leashes for 2 points of contact and a muzzle if needed. And above all else, we just always, always, always have the note, choose the tools that keep you and your dog comfortable and safe. So this is really not just about your dog, it's about the both of you and how you're experiencing this training journey, because our dogs are our best friends most of the time, and we want to make sure that we're having fun as we're teaching them too. So foundation behavior recap. I just love this dog, she's so sweet. Loose leash walking behavior. We want to build a really good loose leash walk. So I will send you some links that you guys can start working on a solid loose leash walk. This is a good one not to overlook. Making sure that your dog can be calm and not too aroused on leash, not too excited when they head out the front door before you start seeing dogs, because we don't want to stack reactivity on top of reactivity where they're already kind of reactive before they walk out the door, and then we bring them around dogs or people or whatever their trigger is. We want to make sure that they already have a nice calm stay with the person 2, capturing check-in and this way, making sure that we're working on our capturing check-in. The dog looks at us and we yes and feed. And then this way is our come with me, the direction that I'm walking. Recall, emergency recall, and let's go. Those all kind of, as you start building one, the others get better. So as you start building one, then the others kind of start to cascade, because they're sort of different type styles of kind of a similar behavior. Touch or push, that's that touch to my hand, is just a nice little behavior to have. And then default weighted doors, thresholds, that sort of thing. So questions. So it looks like we have about 3 minutes left for questions. I am going to stop this screen share on my end, and you're going to see a nice little human screen here, and I will see what questions you guys had today. All right, perfect. So when you're practicing, the question is about the loose leash walking. So when you're practicing the loose leash walking, one of the things to keep in mind, so the question is, my dog bites at the leash. So the dog is jumping and biting at the leash several times. So this is a really good question. So one of the things that we keep in mind is we just remember, we want to troubleshoot those things before we go out. So this is a really good kind of good direction that you were headed in here. What we do there is, I will take the leash, I will hold the leash in my hand. I might keep it scrunched up teeny tiny, as small as I can possibly get it to stay right inside my fist. Like, so it's like almost like a ball, right? Like in my hand, but it doesn't look like a ball. It's kind of weaved together like a leash. And I just show the dog, and then I click and I feed when they're in a calm, already a calm state. So say they're relaxing. I'm not going through the whole process of getting my shoes on, getting my coat on, getting ready to go for a walk, because that's probably the part that's getting them pretty aroused. So I'm kind of taking it out of that training in a different context, where I have them, where I just show the leash, the dog is calm, and I yes and feed. And then I show the leash a little bit longer, yes and feed. And then I might show the leash again, yes and feed. So I'm building this behavior of, or this kind of this nice little fluid, slowly, systematically adding difficulty, in the same way that we do with the jazz up, settle down, where the dog gets excited and comes back down. Except here, we're never adding the get excited part. We're just, our foundation is starting, you see the leash and you're calm. So see the leash, calm, see the leash, calm, see the leash, it comes an inch towards you, click and feed, and then 2 inches towards you, and then 3, and then 5, until I can clip it, click and feed, take it off, yes, click and feed again, do it again, yes, or click, depending on what your marker is. I'm using them kind of interchangeably here, but you'll be consistent in your training. So that's what we're doing there. So we're building that don't bite the leash. Really, the leash, we kind of build that nice calm foundation, and then we might start taking the leash and jingling it around a little bit, and then yes and feed, and then shaking it in the air, and then yes and then feed, and then jumping up and down and getting excited. Now we're adding a little bit of our arousal and making sure that our dogs can do it. So it's a nice little foundation, but that's a really good thought. Your brain's in the right place in terms of knowing, I think that I might have a little bit of a problem here, because I've got a foundation problem. So that's good thinking, Kathy. So, all right, that is it for today. That is all the time we have. Thank you guys so much for joining us this Friday. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have an awesome day. You will get an email probably on Monday from me with the recap here. So have a great day, everyone.